Today we're talking about rising above the rabble. And I suppose you could probably rephrase it as rising out of the rubble. At times we look around and things are falling apart a bit around us. I was just driving in and there's graffiti all over the motorways and everything, and it's just a mess everywhere. There's a lot of wonderful, good things to be found if you look for it, but sometimes it does just feel like things are falling apart a little bit. And then you start to wonder, what is God doing in his world? What's he up to? And I just like to remind myself that, it seems a bit cliche because it's said so often, but, it's darkest just before the dawn. The light shines brighter in the darkness, things like that. So the question is, how are we positioning ourselves to rise above the rabble, above the crowd, to be different? We all know and feel what it is to be a Christian and how it makes a difference in our lives. How do we exhibit that in a way that will have tangible effects on the world around us, not just in ourselves? And I think I've mentioned before, I've been listening to a podcast on the history of Rome. I think I'm about 5 episodes from the end of it. To be honest, I usually listen to it at about 2 a.m. if I've been woken up by, as I was last night, by a child calling out because he's sick and needs me. I'm not actually sure last night whether he did actually cry out or whether it was just in my mind that he could cry out, and I heard a voice and I looked on the monitor, which we have, to see whether he's awake or not, and he was actually asleep. But then it was a couple of hours until I could get to sleep. And one of the best ways that I have for myself getting to sleep is listening to the podcast of the history of Rome. And it was really interesting at the beginning, but now after about 800 and something years of just man's problems and infighting and all these silly things going on, and I just start to wonder why people do all these things. Like a lot of these leaders, they throw everything on the line. They go and murder somebody else so that they can become the next emperor, and 2.5 months later they're deposed, they're dead, somebody else is there. I think, why the heck did they bother in the first place? Anyway, it was all very interesting for a while, but now it just becomes a bit same old, and sometimes I just fall asleep straight away listening to it. And I get to the end of the episode and I think, I don't know what I heard, but at least I got some sleep. But my point is, sometimes I wonder what the point is, but the point of this one was that the time of Jesus came and he had an impact on his own nation because they had lost the plot in a lot of sense, in a lot of ways, and he came and he shone really brightly. And his message after his death and resurrection spread like wildfire. Thousands of people came to know God in a new way, in an exciting way, when everything looked so stale and looked like it was never going to get better. And then that message spread throughout the Roman world. And you can say what you like about whether it was a good thing or a bad thing that in 325-ish, Constantine made the Roman Empire officially Christian and started persecuting people who weren't Christian rather than the Christians being persecuted. But for a while, the whole world was completely changed by the way they did things. It was completely different. They started looking after the people in society that were downtrodden, that weren't looked after. Rome was one of those places where if you had money, you had power. But most of the people didn't have money and didn't have any power. And these people found power in the love of God, and it changed their lives. And then they'd go and tell other people. My point is that when things start to look bad, it's a prime opportunity for God to do something new, to spark something. And I really feel as things are starting to get more and more difficult, as finances are tight for a lot of people, people are taking on crippling debt. There's just a lot going on in this world, and the tools that things like reserve banks have to try and fix these things don't actually fix these things. They just make it worse and harder. I really think that as a lot of people these days are just searching through hedonism for life's meaning, and they're destroying their souls and making life really hard for themselves, having children to numerous different people, all of this kind of stuff, that one day they will be looking for something. And if we have this light that shines bright, people will see that there is something different about us. And so our focus this morning is, how do we ourselves focus on being different? because it's all about walking the walk, not just talking the talk. It's about practicing what we preach. And when we launched phase 1 of the journey a few years ago, and we didn't know that the world was going to be locked down for not much of a couple of years, we had a vision of a flourishing church, and we planted it with something in mind. And there's a few things that have changed as time's gone on, but the heart of why we did it is still the same heart, and the vision that we have is still the same. And we obviously, it was funny because in 2020, I spoke a message about how we could see things clearly, the 2020 vision, that whole pun that everybody uses, the same cliche and everything. But we could see clearly what we were going to do, but we couldn't see clearly that everything was about to change. But right now I can say that I'm excited by that whole COVID thing, hopefully moving on from it and really getting back to what God has for us. And I just want to take a moment to talk about something that I was sharing with somebody during the week that got me excited. I remembered these things that we had been talking about and sharing it with somebody else. They grasped it and thought, man, that's cool. And I just wanted for us to focus in again this morning on this one thing that I was sharing with them. And as you will have heard, we've mentioned previously that we're looking for a home for us, a permanent home, because as amazing as this place has been, there's a limitation to what you can do in a place like this. And we're not part of a community where I feel like most of us come here from somewhere else rather than, being able to have our feet and everything firmly planted in this place. Like during the week, other things are happening here. We're not here during the week, we're in other places. Whereas if we have our own home, we can be a part of the community a lot more. So there's a lot of things that will come from that. We'll be able to do things like running evening services or midweek events or whatever occasionally if that's what is required. And we can have a place that people can come for things like Christians Against Poverty, Cap Money, all those kind of things, alpha courses, whatnot, in the same place, and it will be a place of permanence rather than just a hired hall for 3 hours on a Sunday morning. And when we planted the journey, there were a few triplets that we had that we'd been focusing on and working on, little ways to explain what we saw a flourishing church being about. And one of them that we've mentioned often is communion with God, communion with each other, and communion with the lost. We used to say it every Sunday, now we say it every now and then, but it's really been part of our focus is to make sure that all three elements are present in a church. Sometimes a church will focus a lot on communion with God, or a lot on communion with others, or a lot on communion with each other. But all three need to be present, and all three need to be flourishing to have a really healthy church. And so it's been really great. We've had a focus on God, we've had a focus on each other, and our messages are usually focused on how we can reach out. But as time goes on, we're going to need to continue to focus on all three of those things. So when we were launching, it was important to us that our Sunday services focused on communion with God, because you don't really get that during the week. During the week you have a chance to have communion or relationship or fellowship, however you like to put it, with the lost. I'm sure you're surrounded by people who need to know Jesus. And then, also making time for a relationship with each other, whether it's our small groups or our best friends or things like that. But we wanted to make sure that Sunday was a place that and a time that we could continue to have that focus on communion with God that we might not get during the week. So we've made sure that every Sunday we have that and have a time and space for that. And then also having that opportunity after the service for, egg sandwiches and coffee and all that kind of stuff. One thing that I really enjoyed about spending time in a place up north called Rabble when I was in my early 20s, coming from a big city church here and having spent pretty much my whole life in that church, I went to this place with about 30 people on a Sunday, and they were, the only thing really that drew them all together was the fact that they loved God and that they were in the same location as each other. And, there were some really strange but lovely people, and then there were some really cool people my age, and It was so cool to spend time with people who were really different to myself, because afterwards there was always this space for it. People brought stuff that they'd baked the night before or that morning and brought it in. And I love that in the middle of this city that we have this going on in our church community as well. I think it's really, really cool. But today, instead of focusing on communion with God, communion with each other, and communion with the lost, I want to focus on another triplet that we have said a little bit, but it hasn't had as much airtime. And that's this one. Information is digital, transformation is personal, and application is communal. I'll unpack it, so if you're a little bit lost or it just doesn't initially resonate with you, don't worry. When we were starting to plan what it would be to be the journey, this was something that we said was going to be a part of who we are going forward. And it's not fully in operation yet, but it is always part of our plans going forward. Information is digital, transformation is personal, and application is communal. And this is one of the ways that we're seeking to outwork the vision that God has given it for us in the journey. Firstly, information is digital. Now, the old way of doing church, or actually of doing life, if you think back a few generations ago, or even a couple of decades ago, was very focused, contrary to the way things are going now, on face-to-face relationships. This morning before the service, one of the young guys with snowy white hair was laughing to himself, something that he'd seen on his phone instead of talking to somebody else. And I think that's the way that a lot of the world is going now, you know. And I said, you know, if you've got something funny, I think you should share it with the class. And he said, oh, no, don't worry. But life is getting very focused on phones and whatnot now, and on digital transfer of information rather than personal face-to-face and transfer of information. And Sarah, my wife, and I have been watching The Crown, the TV program, and it's about Queen Elizabeth and the monarchy. And I didn't know enough about what was going on, and with her passing recently, we've decided to watch it and learn a little bit more. We understand it's a dramatization. It's not like they didn't record what was going on at the time and play it for us. But one thing that amazed me, and maybe it shouldn't have, but I just, you know, it was amazing at the time, is thinking back to her coronation, there was a big hoo-ha about the fact that they wanted to broadcast it on TV. You know, but it was this amazing new technological development. And it wasn't a good thing or a bad thing necessarily, but that's the way that things were going. And so they incorporated the TV cameras into the coronation and displayed it on TV for people to watch. And it reminds me a little bit about how church often has to go through changes because of the world. And if you think about people like the Amish, they, you know, forsake technology beyond a certain point, but they also are happy with the technology that was up to maybe a decade or two before they were formed. They have things like the wheel and the horse and cart and all these things. And we can tend to draw lines and say these things before that weren't good or these things afterwards weren't good, or vice versa. But if we're going to stay relevant, and I don't mean that in the wrong sense of the word, but if we're going to stay relevant, being in the world but not of the world, we have to make decisions about all of these different things. Is it good to be on our phones? Do we forsake our phones, or do we use them, but use them as a tool rather than them using us as a tool? You know, so things like that. I think it's funny, I was talking with somebody before the service about organs, playing the organ. Now, I don't play the organ, I play the guitar, and I play a little bit of piano at home because we've got one in our living room. And I think it would be cool to teach my son, who's currently at the dong, 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 I'm playing piano, daddy stage. And one day he'll learn a little bit about scales and and hopefully get some skill and be better than I will ever be at the piano. But there was a point in time at which the organ was not acceptable in church because it was a pub instrument, you know, and then the organ became a part of church, and then it was unacceptable to have rock instruments like guitars later on because organ was the traditional instrument, and life moves on and things change. And one of the ways in which the world is changing is the technology around the transfer of information. It's no longer as much about face-to-face as it is about digital formats and digital media. It wasn't long ago that there weren't billboards all over the streets or constant noise in our lives, and it's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. And again, it's probably not exactly the way that it was, but if you're watching a movie about Victorian times, they sit around in their sitting room drinking tea and talking to each other, or sit there reading a book and everything, and it looks quite charming actually, being able to sit around and have time to just sit, read, talk, all that kind of stuff. But we're so busy doing this and that and the other these days, and constantly dominated by a ding on our phone telling us that we've got a notification. So we look at that and then we get distracted and start scrolling through something else. Life is quite different now. And the company that owns Facebook has recently changed itself to Meta. Meta being like the story behind the story, the big overarching explanation for where things are. They want to be involved in every area of our lives, not just to be one app that we can use for connecting with people that we thought we'd lost decades ago, who we might have gone to school with or whatever. And one of the things that they're working on now is creating virtual worlds where you can put a headset on and you can enter this world, and somebody else on the other side of the world will do the same thing, and you can have these virtual meetings with each other. And there are a number of benefits to this. If you think about the people who fly around the world for business meetings, for instance, they can have those in an instant. And instead of spending a week traveling, instead of spending lots of time and money, instead of the carbon footprint, if you care about things like that, there's a lot of things that they can do away with by being able to have these digital, virtual, face-to-face meetings. Now, I'm not saying whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, but this is what the world is starting to wrestle with and decide about whether we're going to take part in it or not. And of course, it's well known that kids these days spend a lot of time on TikTok or Instagram, or I don't think any of the children are on, the young ones are on Facebook anymore. That's more for people my age and above. And it can be a challenge, and it can affect the way that they interact with each other, and the way that people interact is changing. But it's not all doom and gloom. There are many positives that can come out of these things. The question is, how are we going to use them as a tool rather than us being the tool for these big organizations for data collection, etc. Anyway, so I like to generally, when I'm driving, have silence in my car because of all the noise. But there are opportunities for this digital transfer of information when I'm, say, driving, especially as people spend more and more time in cars, commuting with all the traffic and everything. It's a great time and an opportunity for us to use that information as digital platform or method or media to learn things. It's a great chance to listen to the Bible when you can't read it because you're concentrating on driving and you're not allowed to read, and it wouldn't be wise to anyway. Or listen to a podcast or a sermon, whether it's at 2 a.m. trying to fall asleep or whatever it is. And as we grow and have greater opportunities as a church, this is one of the ways that we will be focusing on how we transfer information. And one of the benefits to that, kind of like that meta virtual thing, is that we can limit the amount of time that we spend traveling for information. I've shared it not for a couple of years, but those midweek courses that you might go to, and really it ends up being about 15 to 30 minutes worth of information. But by the time you rush home from work, you get your dinner ready, you get yourself ready, you go in the car, then you sit around for half an hour waiting for all the people who are late to finally arrive, then you listen to the presentation, then you talk to people afterwards because you don't want to just, listen to 15 minutes of information, then go home, and then you drive home, then you get yourself ready for bed. It's like 3 or 4 hours of time commitment for this tiny bit of information, and that bit of information could have been transferred to you in 15 minutes, and then you could re-listen to it as a podcast or whatever until you get it. But because of the lowest common denominator, often it's 15 minutes of information spread over 45 minutes, and then with questions for people to ask questions that were already answered at the beginning, but they missed it because they were late, that kind of stuff. So there's opportunities when you use digital media for the transfer of information that are really beneficial. But the flip side is that the time we gain, we don't waste it. We use that time for things that are more important than traveling in our cars or rushing around or those kind of things. So that all of that is beneficial to us if the time we save is allocated to something else that is life-giving and good. So imagine instead of having that 15 or 30 minutes of information and 15 or 30 minutes of really rushed, really shallow conversation with people, we used the time that was saved to have a rich and deep conversation with a couple of people, have them over for dinner or whatever, and then listen to that information on the way to work in the morning. So there's ways that we can use that. The other thing is that information in itself can be good, but isn't always going to change our lives. And one example of that is the fact that governments are always talking about education. You know, people smoke. Well, we just need to tell them that smoking is bad. Put it on the packets, that kind of thing. And then people will stop smoking. Information in itself doesn't necessarily change the way that we behave. And that's why we don't just stop at information as digital. This is a triplet. So we've dealt with the first one. The second one is transformation is personal. What good is information, no matter how efficiently it is shared from one person to another, if there isn't transformation that happens in our lives? Romans 12:1 and 2 says, as I read earlier, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And here's the point. We must be changed by what we hear or read or learn. When we consider the information we've been given, when we decide whether it is good or bad, by the renewal of our mind, by testing it with God, we can discern whether it's good and acceptable and perfect or not. The Bible calls that meditation, thinking about these things, taking time, shutting off the noise. And we ask God to change us in light of the information we receive. And that results in transformation. And that's what true worship is, or true service, or as it says here, presenting our bodies as a living sacrifice. I often think about how much information dies along with each person who passes away. And I've often thought about sitting down with my grandparents and getting all this information about them, about my family history, things like that. There's an amazing amount that is gone. And mentioning before the podcast of Rome, these people who had these rich experiences, good or bad, and then they're just brutally murdered because some other egotistical fool wants to be the leader instead, who's then deposed 2.5 months later. It's incredible the amount of information that goes. And with each of us, the question is, what are we doing with that information? How is it transforming us and then being passed on to those around us so it doesn't just die with us? There's so much information, and they say that information at the end of the Second World War doubled every 25 years. It would take 25 years for the amount of information that the world had to double. And a few years ago, they said it was happening every year, doubling. And some people have said it's getting really close to every day, the amount of information that's doubled. And you ask, how can that be? Well, it doesn't necessarily mean good information or better information. It's just the amount of information. Now you'll have people posting the most mundane things or thoughts or whatever on TikTok or YouTube or Facebook or whatever, of them doing these dumb things. And now they've got these little captions down the bottom. Watch till the end. It's like this clickbait stuff. It gets to the end and you go, what? Nothing happened. But there's all this extra information that's happening because people are living in this digital world. And we need to feed ourselves with good information, whether it's from church or from some other source. And we need to test this information because we're being formed and shaped by everything that goes in our eyes and through our ears. And we need to spend time with God, meditating on these things, to decide what information to keep and what not to, because it will transform us whether we like it or not. And that's what communion is about. It's us taking a moment, which we should be doing in our own lives anyway. We should be spending decent chunks of time thinking about and reflecting on these things. But communion is an opportunity for us to take 30 seconds or a minute or a couple of minutes to sit and think about how we are applying God's word or otherwise to our lives and how we're being transformed by it. And to have a chance, if something pops into our head that we've done wrong or that we could have done differently, which for me the last few days has been a plethora of opportunities for me to repent. My kids have been sick and I've been grumpy about it, and I have not been perfect by any stretch of the imagination. And I can blame it on sleep deprivation or whatever. You've all been there before. You're nodding your head but thinking, grow up, little boy. There's always opportunities for us to acknowledge where we have been good and where we have not. And as the psalmist says in Psalm 139, 23 to 24, search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. See if there's any grievous way in me and lead me in the way everlasting. And we should be taking these moments, and that's why we always have that moment on a Sunday morning for us to think about the information going in, the transformation that is taking place in our lives, for good or for bad, to come to God and say, I want your way, not my way, or the way that I've just inherited by default from the world around me. So firstly, information is digital. Secondly, transformation is personal. There's nobody that can transform us in our own lives but ourselves. It's a personal thing. And thirdly, application is communal. Just as without transformation, information is meaningless, also without application, even transformation doesn't mean a lot. You could be the most transformed person in the world. If it doesn't go beyond you, it doesn't really impact the world that much. And you cannot grow too much if the focus is yourself, which today there's a lot of talk about self-love, self-care and all that stuff. It's important, but it's not the be-all and end-all of life. If the focus is others, you will find that you need to be transformed, that you will find that you really need God in a way that you didn't realize you did. And there's a false dichotomy that's crept into our collective psyche, and it's the old standoff between doing and being. Or sometimes in the church we talk about faith versus works, doing versus believing. But life is about both. And we cannot be without doing, just as we can't really do without being. And this is exhibited really well and effectively in my son, 2 going on 3. When I'm talking and I'm teaching him letters or whatever, I can see he's looking at my lips, my tongue, my teeth, and seeing the way I do things, and then he tries to do it himself. When I try and teach him a sound like th, like put your tongue out, touch the top teeth, and he goes, he's not very good at it sometimes, but that's what he's doing. He's watching me to learn. And I've had to start focusing on what I say or don't say. It's quite frightening how he mimics me. This week, Daddy, why you say, what the heck? I'm like, oh no. He's listening to everything and he can repeat the things with accuracy the first time he hears them. So doing and being, human life is about both. It's not about one or the other, who you are or what you do. Both are important and neither can exist in a meaningful way without the other. I like to put it this way, doobie doobie doo. It's like a cycle, both things, and they feed into each other. We're called by Jesus to fulfill the Great Commission, but we can't do it alone. We need each other. If that weren't the way, then each of us would probably be in a monastery or a nunnery or whatever, focusing on our own spiritual growth, isolated from everyone else, because actually it's a lot easier when we do it on our own. When we spend time in solitude, It's really easy to be pretty close to perfect. But then there's other people, and that's where the challenges come. And I often think about things like YWAM, Youth with a Mission. These people, they go out and they're fired up, might be people in their late teens or early 20s. They go out and they spend time surrounded by people with shared values, with a shared mission, and they grow this amazing community. My parents, they were involved with a group called the Agape Force. That's where they met, and they were there after they got married for a couple of years before they went and had children, and we ruined their lives. Blessed them immensely. And the people that they did commission with, that they were serving other people with, are some of their closest friends. And I like to say that you can't have community without commission, the Great Commission. And you can't achieve the Great Commission very effectively without community. We need each other to do that. And they go hand in hand. And when they do, they're far more effective than on their own. But the other side of community is how we are stretched and pushed by each other. Some people like to just prod us and prod us and prod us until we snap. I find those people frustrating. Please don't do that to me. I will snap eventually. But the other side of that is when we do snap, I hope that you all still love me and still treat me well, because Jesus loves you and you are miserable sometimes too. And our congregation is really good at loving each other, at least in this environment where we come and we have communion with God and we have communion with each other later. And while it is a fairly cold spring day and it's school holidays at the moment, and I know of numerous people who are sick who aren't here, a few people are off on the other side of the world enjoying the warmth or at their winter batches with the heaters on, we will grow. The vision that God has given to us and the 4 years of investment so far hasn't been for nothing. And we're going to be spending our efforts, not just on Sunday mornings, but in trying to reach people and share the message effectively. And we are going to see people's lives changed, especially when we have our own place and we're able to be a part of a community like that. But one thing that we're going to need to do and focus on in the next year is to grow in our love for one another. It's got a little bit of depth to it, but it's still very surface level. We're going to have to prepare ourselves for not just the excitement of seeing church grow, but for the challenge of it. It's going to be really difficult. And when people wander in here that are really, really hard to love, what's going to be our response? Is it going to be one of self-sacrifice? Or is it going to be one where we try and hide in the crowd and talk to the people we really like to talk to? There's this other triplet which we're not going to talk about too much this morning. It's belong, believe, behave. And in a society where everybody was Christian or grew up in the church or whatever, it used to be a little bit different. But now in a world where people aren't necessarily Christianized, people don't behave the same way or believe the same things, we need to be a light in that we welcome people who are different. We create a sense of belonging for them even when they're different, even when they don't have the same beliefs as us or behave the same ways. And we need to prepare ourselves now so that when those people come, we will be effective at loving them in a way that is better and different from anything they've ever experienced before. And in a year or so, things are going to change. We're going to be in a different place, God willing. We're going to be doing different things, and we're going to see expansion of the vision. And God is leading us toward growth. But we're going to have to do some hard work ourselves and transformation and application, because no positive change comes without sacrifice. And if we're going to make room for others, we need to turn our eyes from our needs onto theirs. Not completely. We still need to look after ourselves. We still need other people when we go through hard times. But we don't want to be a place full of cliques. We want to welcome new people in. And that might mean that the people we've been looking forward to hanging out with on Sunday, if we see somebody else wander in and they really need somebody else to talk to them, that we focus on them and then we think, actually, I'm going to catch up with so-and-so during the week rather than on Sunday morning. It might mean that there's challenges for us with our small groups. We're surrounded by a group of people that we really like to spend our time with, but we might need to sacrifice that a bit and look for other opportunities to spend time with them so that we can welcome other people in. God makes room for us, and we're going to have to make room for other people. As we wrap up, I want to say that there are challenges from being faithful to the Great Commission, to the mission that God has for us together, the co-mission. But there are also massive benefits. Mentioned previously, groups like YWAM, or Agape Force for my parents. There is richness that comes from community. And somebody said during the week, when we get challenged by other people, we can walk away from them and find somebody else. But when we get through those hard times and those disagreements and we kiss and make up, so to speak, we get this depth of relationship. And a flourishing church to me is a place like that, where we can lose the plot a little bit within reason. We all need to grow up as well and behave as well as we can. But if that happens, are the people around us going to walk away from us or love us? Each of us want other people to love us despite our foibles. So how are we going to be like that to other people? The people who are far and away less lovely than all of you in the room, that will be coming into our congregation in times to come. We're blessed to be a blessing. Man, we are blessed. We are really blessed. Life is full of challenges, as Pastor Paul said. I've been a bit grumpy this week with all the challenges. But we're blessed, and God is doing something amazing in our community, and the best is yet to come. So be encouraged today. Enjoy the opportunity when you come on a Sunday morning to focus on God with the rest of us. It's good to have you here taking communion, focusing on God with each of us. As we go forward, we're going to have a focus, not solely, but a focus somewhat on information being digitally transferred, because that's the way things are going. We will always have a focus on personal transformation, but the thing that we're going to focus more and more on is how we apply that communally. Information is digital, transformation is personal, and application is communal. And that's part of the strategy that we have for building this church in a way that will be effective now in the 2022 onwards for this decade till things change again, to a younger generation, but also to all who God draws into our community from this day forward.